back to her. Reservation wrong, take me home, carry me onward, back to her. Traveling this old dirt road since my younger days. It's taken me to where I want to go, to a love so true and a love so right. Just take me home, take me down Reservation Road. Reservation wrong, take me home, carry me onward, back to her. Reservation wrong, take me home, carry me onward, back to her.
Hey everyone, good to see you. Thanks for joining for our second Lunch and Learn on the President's Page. I'm Ethel Branch, Navajo Nation Attorney General. Nipotwitni Nishla, Nakai Brashishin, Siniduni Dashiche, Ado Nakai Dashanella. East Canyon Diablo Det Nasha, which is in the southern portion of the Loop chapter. And I'm happy to be here with you. I'm excited to have my team here from the litigation unit presenting on Navajo labor and employment law. So again, as people are presenting, feel free to post your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And additionally, if you guys have suggestions on other presentations we might cover, please share that information with us as well. So far, we've had a number of different presentations about the Navajo Nation budget process, how to get a home site lease, and this is all part of the President's effort to make our government more transparent and more meaningful to the Navajo people. So again, today's presentation is Navajo labor and employment law. So this is informational to let folks know in the general public a little bit more about the nation's labor and employment laws. And that goes for employees as well as employers. So we hope you'll enjoy our session. Today we have Sage Metoxen presenting, as well as Louis from our litigation unit, both of them, Louis Millette. And so I'm going to hand things over to our first presenter to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Madam AG. Hi, good afternoon. I saw the advertisement on before I got on the screen, and I am not Colleen Silversmith, so I apologize if anyone's disappointed in that, but I am Sage Metoxen. I am a principal attorney in the litigation unit, the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. A little bit about me, I'm originally from Oklahoma, and I'm a member of the Wichita Tribe of Oklahoma, and I went to the University of Oklahoma. So there's a little trend there. I came out to the nation directly after law school and started working at DOJ in 2014. So I'm getting close to my 10 years here. Like Madam AG said, I'll be presenting alongside my colleague, Louis Millette. He came to us all the way from Alaska, where he's from, and went to UNM Law. He began working after that with the nation in 2017. So as Madam AG kind of went over, DOJ provides legal services to the three branches of the Navajo Nation government. We don't represent individual tribal members, but just the government itself. And DOJ is split into various units that cover different areas of law and assist different divisions and programs and divide it up in that way by subject matter. So the litigation unit is, which was formerly known as the Litigation and Employment Unit. We handle all of the nation's employment matters and other litigation for the nation as a government. So this presentation, as Madam AG said, is just intended to provide overview of employment law in the Navajo Nation, not to give any specific legal advice. So if you do need legal advice on a specific employment law matter, you can seek help from an attorney or an advocate that's licensed to practice in the Navajo Nation, and they should be able to help you resolve that. So our presentation generally is just providing an overview of the universe of the employment law on the nation. What does employment law look like here on the nation? And much of the nation's employment law is centered around the Navajo Preference in Employment Act, which is often referred to as the NPEA. The NPEA can be found in the Navajo Nation Code. It's in Title 15 at Chapter 7. And it was originally passed by Council in 1985. And the intent was to provide employment opportunities for the Navajo workforce and protect the health and safety and welfare of Navajo workers. And there were other purposes that Council had in mind. If you're interested in reading the entire act or all of the purposes that Council had in mind in passing the act, you can find it online. And like I said, it's at Title 15. So it is called the Navajo Preference in Employment Act. So it does provide for preference in employment to Navajo members, but it also generally protects workers' rights. It's a general employment law. It applies to all employers doing business within the territorial boundaries of the nation. So this can get confusing in checkerboard areas or border town areas, but generally you can remember if an employer is operating on the nation's land within the territorial jurisdiction of the nation, then they are subject to the provisions of the NPEA that we're going to discuss. And this includes all employers. So it's private employers, private businesses that you see on the nation, as well as Navajo Nation government or any other employer that operates within the territorial boundaries of the nation. And along with that, it protects all of the employees that work at those businesses or entities on the nation. It protects all employees within the nation, and that does include non-Navajo employees. In some instances, it can apply to employers off the nation's lands if the employer is the nation itself or a wholly owned enterprise or entity or office of the nation that happens to be doing business elsewhere off the nation. So, for example, the nation and its enterprises conduct business or have offices that aren't on the nation in places like Flagstaff or Washington, D.C. So those employers are still governed by the NPEA, and the employees are still protected by all the provisions of the NPEA. Where does the NPEA not apply? The NPEA doesn't apply to independent contractors, only employees. So for independent contractors who provide services on a contract basis within the nation, but don't receive pay and benefits, they're not the same as a regular employee, they don't have regular hours or a workspace and so forth. In those instances, the NPEA does not apply to those individuals. Only regular employees. And there is a provision in the NPEA that discusses contracts, but I'll get into that later towards the end of our conversation here. So if an issue were to arise for one of those independent contractors, it would be resolved as a contract dispute and not under the processes outlined that we're going to discuss today under the NPEA. Where else does the NPEA not apply? Generally, it doesn't apply off the nation. Like I said, there is an exception to that, but generally just within the territorial boundaries of the Navajo Nation. So Louis is going to go into some more detail of the NPEA and the rights and other provisions that are outlined there. Louis?
Okay, thank you, Sage. And if any of you that are watching this live have any questions, feel free to ask a question in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We do have this block for a full hour, but I think it'll go less than an hour, depending on how many questions there are. Like Sage said, I've been working here at Navajo DOJ for almost 6 years. It's my first job out of law school. I haven't worked anywhere else. That should tell you something about what it's like working here at DOJ. And I am an in-law. I'm married to a Navajo woman. We have one son. And so as an in-law, that's probably why I'm doing this presentation today. I just realized I didn't wear my good earrings like Sage and our AG did. So maybe next time. I would note that, again, when we talk about the NPEA, that's just an abbreviation for the Navajo Preference and Employment Act. We have a lot of acronyms and abbreviations on the Navajo Nation, as I'm guessing most of you watching know. There have been several amendments to the Navajo Preference and Employment Act, so those can be a little challenging to keep up with for anybody, even lawyers that work in this field, in the employment law field. And one of the issues is that the Navajo Nation Code Book, the hard copy blue bound books, have not been updated in a number of years. And I don't remember when the last time an updated version of the Navajo Nation Code was released, but it's been a long time. So we've done our best to compile amendments to the NPEA, especially as they have to do with the actual employment work we do in our unit, which largely has to do with giving supervisors and managers that work for the Navajo Nation central government and its chapters advice on employment issues. That's largely what we do. So we try to keep up with the amendments that affect that type of work. Silence my phone here. If we had a comprehensive updated version of the Navajo Nation Code, we could just flip to the code, or at least the pocket part in the back for the updates, which haven't been updated in a number of years, like I said. That would make it a lot easier. But instead, what we have is we have the code books, some of us do, and then we have a series of either electronic or paper council resolutions that are amending the NPEA, so we can keep up with the changes in the act that affect the law on the Navajo Nation as it relates to workers in management. So when I'm talking today, and I think this goes for Sage too, and she's going to come back and finish up at the end with some final closing bits of information. But when we talk and give some of our personal observations or commentary, just keep in mind that's our personal stuff. That's not DOJ's view necessarily, or the Navajo Nation's view. And if you find or discover that we've misspoken or made an error, feel free to let us know, and we can look into that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the main sections of the Navajo Preference and Employment Act that affect labor and employment law on the nation. Keep in mind, like I said, these might have been recently amended or could be amended in the future. So if you are an employee or an applicant for a job, you might want to double check on the current status of the law if you're facing a question or an issue related to what we're talking about today. We can't give you advice as an individual employee or applicant, as we represent the Navajo Nation government, but you can always talk to an advocate or an attorney just to make sure that that you know what the law says and how it might affect your situation. So let's talk about one part of the Navajo Preference and Employment Act. And Sage mentioned that act is found in Title 15 of the Navajo Nation Code. So let's talk about 15 Navajo Nation Code Section 606, which covers unions. A lot of people might not know that unions have existed on the Navajo Nation and that it's legal to have unions on the nation. Unions have been representing employees on the Navajo Nation for many years, actually. And that's shown by, for example, a 1994 council resolution that was passed to provide rules and enforcement procedures to permit collective bargaining for employees of the Navajo Nation, its agencies, or enterprises. That's HSCJY-63-94. So almost 30 years ago. And that one was specifically for Navajo Nation employees, including companies that are owned by the Navajo Nation enterprises like NACE or such companies that the nation owns. But just generally speaking, on the Navajo Nation, under the Navajo Preference and Employment Act, workers can organize, bargain collectively, and strike and picket unless you're a Navajo Nation employee, government or enterprise employee. Those Navajo Nation government and enterprise employees cannot strike or picket. That's written into the law for various reasons. And just so some of you are aware, if you're not already aware, the Navajo Nation is currently negotiating new collective bargaining agreements with an international union. So you might see announcements about that union representation is going to be active somewhat soon. You might see union representatives talking to workers about this. And that's going to be for the Navajo Nation executive branch employees only, though. And one thing to note about unions before I move on is that under one part of the NPEA, Section 604B3, an employer's seniority system can't circumvent the NPEA. So what that means is most of the time when you're dealing with a union, the union has some sort of system designed to give different levels of seniority rights to the employees. So basically what it means is that an employee has been working for that employer or has been a union member for a longer time than another, has more rights and can be promoted before newer employees or apply for and be hired into a union job before employees that don't have as much seniority. But the thing is, those seniority rights under whatever collective bargaining agreement has been negotiated for that union can't get around the Navajo Preference and Employment Act requirements for Navajo preference. And I don't have personal knowledge of this, but I think there's probably a reason for that, probably rooted in the past and some things that might have happened where that was attempted. So basically, even though there's a seniority system for a union under the CBA, that can't conflict with the NPEA. The system of Navajo preference under the NPEA still applies. And the seniority system has to bend to meet the NPEA's requirements. Let's talk about one of the main sections of the Navajo Preference and Employment Act that we deal with, Sage and I, and our supervisor and our colleague Colleen and our newest attorney Tamara, that we work with the most when we deal with employment cases and giving advice to Navajo Nation management. That is Section 604 of the NPEA, Rights of Workers. Now, Sage mentioned that the NPEA is a general employment and labor statute, and it has this section of the NPA has lots of subsections that deal with different things. So I'm going to go through them, most of them, the major ones, and walk you through them. Section 604B5 tells us that employers have to use Navajo Nation employment sources and job services for employee recruitment and referrals, unless the employer selects one of their current Navajo employees, like a promotion from within. Section 604B6 says that employers have to advertise jobs in at least one newspaper and one radio station serving the Navajo Nation, like KTNN, KGAK, one of those radio stations, and then maybe Navajo Times, probably some border town newspapers like the Farmington paper, the Gallup paper, that also serve the nation. And again, they have to do that unless they select a Navajo from within the organization, as in that previous section. And I think the reason for that is that advertising requirement is so people on the nation will know that there's these jobs available and they can apply for them. Again, it probably comes from some problems that happened in the past where people didn't know about jobs that were available. Section 604B7 is basically a non-discrimination and disability rights section, and that has been updated recently in 2018. That was amended. How that reads now is that it first read just basically one sentence: all employers shall use non-discriminatory job qualifications and selection criteria in employment, which doesn't tell you a whole lot, I think. What does non-discriminatory job qualifications mean? What are non-discriminatory selection criteria? That's open to interpretation. So it was amended, that section was amended in 2018 to add, no person otherwise qualified for a job shall be denied selection for or retention in employment because of his or her disability, so long as reasonable accommodations can be made that would allow that person to perform his or her employment duties. And that's from the Civil Rights of Individuals with Disabilities Act of 2018, a Navajo Nation Council resolution. Basically, all that's doing is saying that an employer can't decide not to hire somebody just because they're disabled if they can make some sort of accommodations for that disability that would allow that person to be able to work on the job. Now, that's subject to all the other qualification requirements too for the job. They have to be qualified for the job, but this is assuming they're qualified for the job and taking into account Navajo preference too. So what does it mean, best qualified? Some of you might have heard that term used and or might have come across it yourself when you applied for a job. What does it mean to be best qualified? First of all, this goes to the basis for the whole NPEA, Navajo preference. Keep in mind that it's Navajo preference, not Native preference or Indian preference, like some other tribes have. Navajo Nation is fairly unique, I think, in that way, in that there is a preference for Navajos, and later, as you look here, their spouses, Navajo spouses, but no general Native or American Indian Alaska Native preference. So Navajos have a higher status hiring preference when applying for jobs. And I believe by that means Navajo tribal members. There's also what I would call as an in-law preference, and that is for people who are married to Navajo tribal members. And that in-law preference is lower than the preference for Navajos, but higher than the status of non-Navajos when applying for a job. And there is a section in the NPEA about this exact preference. There is a section on non-Navajo spouses. I think it's gotten moved around a bit in the NPA in recent amendments, but it is in there. And the requirement is that the spouse must be legally married to a Navajo with a valid marriage certificate for proof. So they don't go off a common law marriage. You have to have a valid marriage certificate that's legal. And so then what would happen if that qualification is met with that valid marriage certificate, the non-Navajo spouse would be placed into the pool of Navajo candidates, but they would have a secondary level of priority after the Navajo applicants. But again, going back to the whole qualification assessment system, all the applicants would have to be qualified for the job in the first place. So that's the threshold thing that you have to show that you qualify for the job as it's advertised. Usually in the job advertisements list the qualifications for the job. So you have to get hired or selected for the job, you have to be the best qualified applicant in a pool of applicants. That term pool, in our view, means more than one applicant. A pool doesn't mean just one person. And so basically what it means is the employer can't hire somebody out of a two or more applicants that is less qualified than someone else. And the employer doesn't have to hire anyone if they don't want to. They can decide not to hire, re-advertise the position, and evaluate the candidates that apply under the re-advertised position. Okay, so we're going to talk now about one of the two main sections that Sage and I deal with in our daily work for the DOJ litigation unit. This one has to do with adverse action, and that is section 604B8 of the NPEA. Section 604B8, and just to start off with, what does adverse action mean? It generally means anything that affects ongoing employment for a worker. And so that could be something like, being fired or suspended from your job, or lesser things that might not be as obvious in the category of adverse action, like possibly getting a pay cut or something like that, even if you're not suspended or terminated. So I'm going to go to one of the more recent amendments of section 604B8 and read what it says. I'm not going to read all of the amendments because there are a lot and they're not all compiled in one place. But I'm going to read this one section that talks about basically discipline and things like that under adverse action. I seem to move my stuff around a little bit. Let me see if I can find it. I think one of my little tabs fell off. Okay, so what 604B8 says is all employers shall not penalize, discipline, discharge, nor take any adverse action, there's that term again, against any Navajo employee without just cause. And we'll talk about that just cause, the meaning of just cause in a bit. A written notification to the employee citing such cause for any of the above actions is required in all cases. And then it goes on to talk about at-will employees, provided this subsection shall not apply to division directors or to the other employees and officials of the Navajo Nation who serve, pursuant to a specific provision of the Navajo Nation Code at the pleasure of the council, standing committees of the Navajo Nation, the president, the speaker, chief justice, or the attorney general like me. Sage and I are at-will employees that serve at the pleasure of the attorney general. And so we don't have to have just cause for our adverse actions because we're at will. We can be terminated at any time for any reason or no reason at all. Just an example of at will employees. Most employees are not at will though. And so if their supervisors want to, say, discipline them, they have to provide just cause. And also, one requirement in the NPA is that the employer has to provide contemporaneous written notice of the reasons for the disciplinary or adverse action. And basically what that means is the supervisor has to give that employee something in writing that says why they're being disciplined or whatever the action is, explains what it's about, what it's for, and provides them with any grievance rights that they might have. So the employee knows what the disciplinary action is for and that they can file a grievance if they want to. Now, the just cause requirement is mandatory if the employer has a employment or personnel manual, which usually the larger employers have. The Navajo Nation government employers have them. Then that usually defines what just cause is. But basically, it's a reason for the disciplinary action, and it has to be a just cause reason. It has to be a good reason. It can't just be a reason that doesn't make sense or a reason that wouldn't be a good reason for the disciplinary action. I should note that there is no NPA requirement that the employer has a personnel manual. So if you work for or applying for a smaller employer, maybe my boss Paul gave the example of one of these smaller medical transport companies that drives people to their appointments, their medical appointments. Maybe they only have 1 or 2 cars. They're a small company. They might not have a full-on manual like the Navajo Nation does or some of the chapters do. For the central government employees, the current manual is 92 pages long. It's fairly comprehensive and robust. Other employers might have a smaller, more basic, to-the-point manual or no manual at all. So you'll want to check and find out with whoever the employer is if you have a manual, and if you do, read it all the way through, get very familiar with it. But going back to 604B8, the main points are that if the supervisor, the employer, is going to discipline an employee or take some sort of adverse action, it has to be for just cause, and the employee has to get contemporaneous written notice, something in writing at the time when they're being informed about it, for it to be valid. Now, one other thing that Sage and I and the others in our unit work on a lot is harassment. And we just call it harassment to simplify it. It falls under a section of the NPA that talks about other things like prejudice and intimidation and sexual harassment, but we categorize it generally as harassment. And that's section 604B9 of Title 15. So section 604B9 starts out by saying that all employers shall maintain a safe and clean working environment and provide employment conditions which are free of prejudice, intimidation, and including sexual harassment. Now that was amended to include a provision prohibiting sexual harassment. The NPA didn't always have an express prohibition on sexual harassment, but that was added. It's worded a little strangely, but our interpretation, even though it's worded weird, our interpretation is that Section 604B9 prohibits general harassment or intimidation or prejudice, and it prohibits sexual harassment, both of them. Then that Section 604B9 goes on to say that the employee alleging a violation of this subsection shall have the burden of proof to show that violation by a preponderance of the evidence. So that's if the employee files a harassment type grievance or sexual harassment grievance. If it goes to an evidentiary hearing in the Office of Hearings and Appeals or the Navajo Nation Labor Commission, the employee who filed that grievance has to put forth enough evidence or good enough evidence to prove their case, to prove that they were harassed or sexually harassed. And then an interesting addition, a recent amendment from 2017, finishes the Section 604B9 by saying an employee may not file an action under the Domestic Abuse Protection Act to seek to restrain a supervisor or coworker for a dispute arising out of the employment relationship. So that's a statutory requirement, making it so, for example, one worker can't file for a protective order against their coworker or against their supervisor for something that happened at work. And that's our view, and at least in our unit of DOJ, that is how the Domestic Abuse Protection Act should be limited or constrained. And it makes sense because work isn't a domestic situation. And so I think that's why that amendment was made, just to clarify that a worker can't file a protective order against their boss or against their coworker, because it could be misused. So that's Section 604B9, basically a harassment section. Those are the two most common things that pretty much the only things that we see cited when employees file employment grievances. Now, employees do have grievance rights. The employees have a right, and applicants, if they weren't selected, they have a right to file a non-selection grievance, and have, as long as they file it properly and follow all the correct procedures, have that grievance heard in a hearing where they can produce evidence and have witnesses testify on their behalf to say why they should have been hired or why they shouldn't have been suspended, and so on, why they shouldn't have been harassed. And a grievance is basically something that the Navajo Nation has decided to provide a structure for the employees and applicants to be able to challenge decisions that are made that affect their hiring or their ongoing employment or things that happen at work. And some employers, especially off reservation, and in other states, they don't even offer that option. So really, the Navajo Nation is giving the employees a lot of rights by allowing for the employees to file these grievances and have a hearing officer or commission members hear what they have to say and listen to them and decide if the employee is right and something needs to be fixed. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole grievance process that the Navajo Nation has in its personnel manual. There are other manuals, like chapter manuals. I have for LGA certified chapters, like Baca Pruitt, Red Springs, Casamaro Lake, Chinle, Noslini, Pinon, Bird Springs, Loop. those LGA certified chapters have their own personnel manuals, and they're different than the Navajo Nation central government personnel manual. So the grievance process isn't going to be the same for LGA certified chapters and non-certified chapters, or for a program in the central government like Department of Health or DOJ or Social Services or DOTI. So I can't go through the whole, like all the different possible grievance processes. So I'm just going to give you a general overview of what the grievance processes look like. Like I said earlier, the Navajo Nation central government uses the personnel policies manual, and that gets updated from time to time. The last time I think it got updated was in 2020, June 3rd, 2020. This version right here, which is also posted on the Department of Personnel Management website. You can click on it and read it if you don't have a hard copy. I'm old school, so I like to have a hard copy to thumb through, to tab, to write things on. But those LGA certified chapters, because a lot of their personnel manuals were formalized and adopted by the chapters many years ago, maybe 2004 or 2015. And a lot of times what happened is they just took the current version of this and adopted it as their chapter manual. And most of them haven't been updated since then, since they were first adopted. There's been no changes made. So you get all these various different versions of chapter manuals. Non-certified chapters use this thing. They use the Central Government Personnel Policies Manual. Other employers, like I said, may or may not have their own personnel manual. They don't have to reflect exactly what's in the Navajo Nation manual. So that's going to be different. And those non-Navajo Nation employees can file grievances through the Office of Navajo Labor Relations, or ONLR, as it's more commonly known. Those grievances go through ONLR on the ONLR process, which can take months, because ONLR does investigations and makes a determination in a right to sue letter. And then after ONLR issues its right to sue letter, then the grievance can proceed to the Navajo Nation Labor Commission. Certified chapters can have, their employees can file grievances through ONLR and the Labor Commission. They can also go through the grievance process through the Office of Hearings and Appeals, like non-certified chapters employees do. The Office of Hearings and Appeals has its own requirement for chapters to write a letter saying they want to use the OHA grievance process and hearing process. And the last we heard is that the chapters would need to file such a document with OHA for the employees to be able to use OHA for grievances. Now, the Central Navajo Nation government uses the Navajo Nation Personnel Policies Manual that I just showed you. Those grievances go through the Office of Hearings and Appeals, Navajo Nation Office of Hearings and Appeals, and a hearing officer will hear those grievances. But generally, with some variations, depending on the manual you're using, grievances start out with a first step where the employee who's filing the grievance usually is required to give notice to their supervisor who allegedly violated the NPEA, and say that they want to talk to them about what happened or what should have happened in their view. That's usually referred to as a step one grievance. And the idea is for the employee to be able to talk through their concerns, their problems with that supervisor, and try to come to a resolution before it goes to either OHA or the Labor Commission and get really complicated and adversarial and not too fun and take a long time going through that litigation process in doing a grievance hearing with evidence and witnesses testifying, and then a decision by somebody else at the end, which one party or both might not like. the step one is designed to be more of sort of like a traditional talking things out type of way of solving the problem. Doesn't always happen. It doesn't have to happen, but at least it's an option that's out there. If that doesn't work, then usually there's a next step that the grievance goes to, and that allows the employee, usually, this is the general way it goes, not always, but usually the employee and the supervisor meet with a third party, sometimes like from Department of Personnel Management, to have something like a mediation to see if that can resolve the problem. If that doesn't happen, or if that doesn't work, then it can go to OHA or the Labor Commission. And then you do go through the adversarial litigation process and battle it out and see who wins in the end. And then even in those cases, whoever loses can potentially appeal the loss to the Navajo Supreme Court to get if they feel there's an error that the hearing body made, either OHA or the Labor Commission. So that's kind of the general grievance process. What if your employer doesn't have a manual like this with a written grievance process? What do you do if you want to file a grievance? You can call up ONLR or go into ONLR. They have a form you can fill out. I think it's called a charge form. And you fill it out, all the information, sign it, submit it to ONLR, give it to them, and they'll review it, do some investigation, and like I said, make a determination on a right to sue letter, and then it would potentially go through to the Labor Commission. So even if your employer doesn't have a manual, you can still file a grievance. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to hand it back over to Sage so she can tell you about some of the other NPEA sections that we don't always work on, but we kind of want to give you a heads up on what they are and what they cover. So if you want to look it up, you can. And just so you're aware that it's out there and the NPEA covers these topics. And then if we have any time for questions at the end, we'll cover those. Thank you.
Thank you, Louie. I'm just going to go really quickly over the remaining provisions of the NPEA that we don't see very often and then that don't get addressed very often, just so you're aware of them. I promise to do it very quickly. I also promise that we tried our best to make this interesting presentation, but we understand that employment law, much like tax law, is just not very exciting. So quickly, Section 607 of the NPEA discusses Navajo prevailing wage. This is a really long section, but basically it just explains fair pay in construction projects. It defines prevailing wage, how it's determined, who it covers, and so forth. Section 608 talks about health and safety of the Navajo workers. This is a very short section. It's in fact just one sentence long, and it requires all employers in the nation to adopt occupational safety and health standards. There is a Navajo Nation Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or NOSHA, and they are tasked with educating and enforcing occupational safety standards for all workplaces in the Navajo Nation. Section 609 deals with contract compliance. This is the section that I mentioned earlier. This covers all contracts entered into by employers within the nation, and it requires them to contain certain provisions so that the parties will agree to abide by the NPEA. So it covers contracts, subcontracts, leases, subleases, collective bargaining agreements, basically any type of employment-related contract that takes place within the nation. And specifically, this section requires contracts to have a provision that says the employer and any other contracting party affirmatively agree to strictly abide by all the requirements of the NPEA. Section 610 is monitoring and enforcement. This just discusses ONLR. I think Louie did a good job detailing what ONLR is and what the process is. this section goes into that. It covers investigation of charges, dismissal of charges, probable cause, labor commission proceedings, and so forth. So ONLR and the Labor Commission have their own rules that are separate from the NPEA. And as I said, whenever I started this presentation, the NPEA is the Navajo Preference and Employment Act. ONLR, I believe, as Louis said, is the Office of Navajo Labor Relations. So then Section 611 also covers hearings in the Labor Commission, which I think Louis generally discussed. And Section 615 discusses polygraph tests. I'm not sure where this came from or the reasoning behind this, what council had in mind, but this section says that no person shall be required to submit to a polygraph as a condition of new or continuing employment. That includes discipline, discharge, anything like that. You can't be required to take a polygraph test to get a job, to continue your job, or anything related to your job. And finally, Section 616 designates the Human Services Committee of the Navajo Nation Council as the oversight committee of the NPEA. So they have the authority to make rules and regulations under the NPEA, to enforce and implement the NPEA, or to make amendments to it. So if you've heard anything today that has caught your attention, or you have any ideas that would make the NPEA better or employment law better on the nation, then you should reach out to the Human Services Committee with those ideas. So that concludes our presentation portion of this. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and thank you so much for listening in to our presentation today. We appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much, Louis and Sage. That was a great presentation. Hopefully folks listening learned a good bit. And just a reminder that this is presenting on the nation's labor and employment laws, and that these apply to all employees on the Navajo Nation, whether they work for the Navajo Nation government or not. So the scope is very general. And we do have a question about how to access laws. I don't know if Louis or Sage have a recommendation on the best way to do that, particularly relating to small business laws.
Thank you, Madam AG. I think, like earlier, I said that most of the nation's laws, can be found online. The entire code can be found online and code amendments. One place that's easy to access it is at the Navajo Nation Council website. And I think it's just Navajo Nation Council, maybe .com, and .org, excuse me. And then all of the resolutions and more recent things that have been passed by council can be found. Louis, do you remember that website? I can't remember what that one is called.
I think it's on Office of Legislative Council, or Office of Legislative Services, and it's called DIB, DIBBS, something like that. And you have to click on some drop-down menus, and there's a search function. It's a little clunky, but you can narrow down your search by time frame. When you think this amendment or resolution was passed, you can filter it by committee that might have passed it, like Health, Education, Human Services Committee for Employment resolutions, making amendments to the NPEA. That's one way to do it. Sometimes just a simple Google search will produce hits on what you're looking for, and it'll show the resolutions, the actual like PDFs of resolutions for the topic you're looking at. I've done that myself as a lawyer. And then also, if you have access to some of the for-profit or nonprofit legal research services like Westlaw or LexisNexis or FastCase, or there's a Harvard, I think, nonprofit search function that seems to be really useful, especially for older Navajo Nation cases and laws. That can be used too. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. AG might know about it since he's a Harvard grad, a triple Harvard grad. But there are resources out there, and I think if you're getting stuck, you can probably call Office of Legislative Services and try to have somebody walk you through how to find these legislations and the case law. There's also hard copies. I'll get one right now.
And while Louis does that, just to also point out that for small businesses in particular, or businesses in particular, Business Regulatory has a website, and they have a lot of information on there about how to get started and what you need to do as a small business on the Navajo Nation. So that would be a good place to start.
Right, and there are a lot of requirements that, especially if you're new to business on the Navajo Nation, a lot of people aren't aware of. Procurement rules, the bidding process, things like that. I don't know exactly how they apply to every situation. I know a little bit about how they apply to Navajo Nation government procurement, but it might be different for, if you're the one trying to make a bid, you want to know how that process has to work when you're submitting bids. And these are, this is an old version of the Navajo Reporter. This is a volume 4. This is volume 7. You can get these from the Navajo Supreme Court or the elusive volume 5, where you have to go to Diné College. It's a good reason to drive over there. It's a nice drive, and get the volume 5 for $50, which I actually did. Some of those you can buy off of eBay, especially the older ones. I got these off of eBay. This one says Law Library of Maricopa County. I don't know who sold it, but I ended up buying it off of eBay. So those are some ways to access it. And there's also DNA. You can talk to somebody there if you need a point in the right direction, or maybe try to do some research.
Yeah, and the Navajo Nation Museum has a library that has these documents in it as well. Again, there is a challenge in how often the code is updated to incorporate recent case law too, but also amendments to the Navajo Nation Code. So that can be a challenge. And Louis mentioned Diné College's library. If you're in Phoenix or Albuquerque, the law schools there will have collections in their libraries as well. So the library is a great place to get started in looking for these materials. But again, there are online resources as well. So go ahead.
Sorry, Madam AG. One last resource is the Navajo Nation Judicial website. They have a thing you can click on the left side. It will take you to the recent Supreme Court opinions from, I think, going back about 7 years, going back to the last volume of the Navajo Reporter. So you can click and get all the opinions over the last 7 to 10 years, 11 years. And I've had to do that, and I printed those out, so I have them in a little folder for each year, so I can look at the new case law.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question about taxation. I don't know if the individual is a tribal member who raised the question, but there was a comment about paying taxes, state taxes, employment taxes in Arizona and New Mexico as a tribal employee. Do you guys want to say anything to that?
I can say what I know as a Navajo Nation employee. I can't say how it would apply in every situation, but I think I'm a good example of how it can work. And I'll just say it really quickly. I live on the New Mexico side, west of Gallup. I work on the Arizona side in Window Rock. So I have to pay both New Mexico state tax and Arizona state tax. And then I think the way I understand it, there is an offset when you actually do your taxes and file them. there's some kind of an offset between the two states, and I usually get some sort of a refund. But it's pretty complicated, and that's one of the reasons why I go through a tax professional, just to make sure I don't mess it up.
But if you are a Navajo Nation member living and working on the Navajo Nation, then you should not be paying state taxes. So that's another aspect of that issue.
Great. Thank you guys for your insights on that. And we have another question from Justin Sosi asking if there's a collective bargaining agreement in place for Navajo Nation employees, and if so, its application with or how that works with respect to the Navajo Preference and Employment Act and the PPM, the Personnel Policies Manual for the Navajo Nation government.
Justin Sosi, that name sounds familiar for some reason. Yeah, thanks, Justin, for that question. There are currently 3 collective bargaining agreements that are undergoing renewed renegotiation right now. And so that's kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning of my portion of the presentation, that the nation and United Mine Workers of America are working to get those 3 CBAs updated, renegotiated, and finalized. And at some point, I can't say exactly when, it just depends on how quickly we can get through the negotiation process, there will be votes to ratify the CBAs. And so be looking out for that, be looking for union reps to be talking to employees about the CBAs and the different provisions in it, and how it would affect you as a union member. Or if it doesn't cover you, like if you're a supervisor or what they call a confidential employee who would not be subject to union membership under a CBA. So yeah, it's a pretty complex topic. I don't want to get into too many details about it, but the current administration is all for working with the union to get these CBAs negotiated and put it to a vote of the employees.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for watching. We hope you found today's presentation informative, and we will continue doing these Lunch and Learn presentations on Fridays. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
You like it? You like it, Olivia? You like it? Yeah.